Joyce is saying something to Obama that no one like her could have said before the civil rights victories of the 60s. That she trusts mainstream America with her mixed-race background more than she trusts black America. Whites treat her like a person. Blacks make everything racial. Joyce is Obama's troublesome doppelganger. As he grinds through the little self-betrayals that help him belong to blackness and gestures his identification in every way he can, she is that ghostly whisper saying that he is going in the wrong direction. "What you want," she murmurs, "the chance to be yourself, racial self-acceptance, is not with blackness. It is in the same American mainstream you came from." But Joyce, for all her mixed-race insight, is only voicing a theme that has always been present in black life, just as it is present in all minority cultures, the theme of leaving. Toward the end of his community organizing days on the South Side, Obama starts to feel considerable survivor's guilt about leaving these decimated black neighborhoods for arguably the best law school in the country, and thus for a new mainstream life of unimaginable possibilities. He expects to encounter resentment from the people he will leave behind, and he feels the need to explain himself. But Johnny, his fellow organizer, needs no explanation. "I knew it," he says when Obama first mentions his plans. Asked how he knew, Johnny says, "Damn, Barack. 'Cause you got options, that's why. 'Cause you can leave. When somebody's got a choice between Harvard and Roseland, it's only so long somebody's going to keep choosing Roseland." So Johnny knows what Joyce knows. Those who can leave do leave, and are usually better off for it. Assimilation, not blackness, is the road to success. But for Obama, to the mainstream born and without the security of knowing himself within the group, yet more emphasis on assimilation might well feel like laboring to become nobody. After all, he was in Chicago to get to know himself within the group, within its cultural specificity and its character. Sure, success required leaving, but Obama had also left the mainstream to find himself on the black South Side. Leaving the South Side, even for the best of reasons, was to risk losing the black self he had worked so hard to erect. Perhaps this was the anxiety, this fear of losing the idea of himself as black, that finally came between Obama and the white girl he had fallen in love with after college in New York. For almost a year, they had lived inside their own private world, with a shared language and customs. Even her family, when they went for a weekend to her family's country house, was nothing less than gracious. But while he was there, standing in her grandfather's impressive study, he had an epiphany. She was from a very different world than his, and I knew that if we stayed together I'd eventually live in hers. After all, I'd been doing it most of my life. Between the two of us, I was the one who knew how to live as an outsider. Obama knows all too well what the future will be like with this woman. If their relationship became enduring, and surely they would want it to if they married, he would be permanently consigned to a life in the American mainstream. In other words, he would be back where he had started, back with that old racial anomie and identity ambiguity that had been the suffering of his youth. After all, it was life in the mainstream that had given him the hunger to know himself as black. And maybe, as much as anything else, he was tired of feeling that hunger, tired of having it control the arc of his life. Maybe he wanted to resolve it once and for all. So then he looked into the future with this woman and saw his past. He had begun to build a black self, to take on a racial specificity, and whatever snares and delusions this direction might hold in store, he would at least be covering new ground. And so he began to push her away. They fought one night outside a theater after seeing an angry black play. She couldn't understand why black people were so angry all the time. In the car afterward, she cried, saying she would be black if she could, but she couldn't. She could only be herself, and wasn't that enough? Obama's sister, Alma, who hears him recount this story, says finally and accurately, "That's a sad story, Barack." He confesses that when he thinks of what she said that night, it somehow makes me ashamed. Little wonder. He rejected her because of her race, and this surely required what race-based decisions have always required, that we serve race at the expense of what is human in us, thus his feeling of shame. Here was a gesture of identification that required a measure of cold-heartedness, and yet, was his decision strength or weakness? I used to laugh when my own mother, married to my father until death them did part, would say, "You know, interracial marriage is not for everyone." She was never impressed to meet another interracial couple, never patted them on the back for being courageous. People had to truly know themselves, she believed. They had to accept both the freedom to live as they chose and the price they would pay for doing so. What seems clear is that Barack Obama is a man who truly wants to be black, a man who is determined to resolve the ambiguity he was born into. Does this disqualify Obama for the presidency? It may. There is a price to be paid even for fellow traveling with a racial identity as politicized and demanding as today's black identity. This identity wants to take over a greater proportion of the self than other racial identities do. It wants to have its collective truth, its defining ideas of grievance and protest, become personal truth. And then it wants to make loyalty to this truth a reflex within the self, within one's own thoughts, so that all competing thoughts are conceived in disloyalty. A perfectly internalized censorship. To be authentically black is to think more as a black than as oneself. And the terms of this identity are very clear. You must join a politics that keeps alive the idea of white obligation to blacks. Social determinism must be your world view, so that you can see blacks as systemically and structurally aggrieved, even when no actual oppression is apparent. You may mention black responsibility in relation to black uplift, but to be black, you must always land on a deterministic explanation of black difficulty. Determinism automatically blames and obligates white power for black problems, so it becomes the central faith of the black identity. When a black argues against it, he invokes the Uncle Tom label. Such is the enmeshment of politics, ideas, and history in today's black identity. The point is not that Barack Obama is a blind and true-believing follower of this identity. Few blacks are. The point is that he is accountable to it. If, for example, Obama broke with this determinism by saying that blacks themselves were largely responsible for closing the academic achievement gap with whites, he would likely be seen as an Uncle Tom for letting whites off the hook. So, in order to be black, he must pay tribute to a determinism that makes whites ultimately responsible for black uplift, even when it is obvious that only black responsibility will make a difference. These are the identity pressures within which Barack Obama lives. He is vulnerable to them because he has hungered for a transparent black identity much of his life. He needs to be black. And this hunger, no matter how understandable it may be, means that he is not in a position to reject the political liberalism inherent in his racial identity. For Obama, liberalism is blackness.